it's going to be a lot of fun. So I hope you'll come back next Sunday night. The day before, Saturday, is the greatest gift here for children K through 5th grade. It's at 9, starting at 9 in the morning, going through 3 o'clock. Please help us spread the word. They can sign up by calling the church, or there is a web, they can do that online, VBS Mate, I believe, .org, something or other like that. I think it's in here. But it's on all the signs around town. There it is, vbsmate.com, FBCDFS. So I'm seeing more and more kids sign up for that, so I'm getting excited about doing that. It ought to be a lot of fun. And tonight, thank you for being here. We have Mrs. Gail Hartzog with us to... I didn't bring my glasses, so I did bring my glasses. I'm going to have to put them on. They will work much better than in my pocket. There's the words. Ms. Hartzog is a member of Parkview, and her husband is a member of Parkview Baptist Church of Lake City. She recently retired as Dean of Development Planning at Chipola College in Marianna. She's also a teacher for several years, 9 years at the Baptist College in Florida over in Graceville. And she has done this monologue many times throughout the South on the life of Charlotte Lottie Diggs Moon, a missionary who served 40 years in China. However, the most important thing about her that you need to know is she is the sister of Gardis Watts over there. And that's very important. We're going to take just a moment. I see a lot of new faces. We love to have new people here and visitors and guests. We're going to stand up for just a moment and shake some hands, introduce yourself. All right? Let's do that.
Of salvation from God's own holy word. I love to tell the story. 'Twill be my theme in glory to tell the old story of Jesus and his love. You may be seated.
I have to hurry because I know they'll be wondering what. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I thought I was in a Baptist church. He says I am in a Baptist church. Is this the First Baptist Church of DeFuniak Springs, Florida? Oh my goodness, how times have changed. I can't believe what some of you are wearing. And we came on a motorized vehicle. Oh, it was wonderful. We turned here and there, you know. You live in a lovely place. And I kept asking the driver to turn here and there, you know. And we seem to have run late. Is there a Mrs. Stuckey here? Mrs. Stuckey? Oh, listen, I know this is not what we discussed, but I can tell you're ready for me to begin, so I'll just go ahead and we'll talk about this later. My name is Charlotte Diggs Moon. I was 40 years a missionary in China. Now, you might not have heard of Charlotte Moon, but if you find yourself in a Baptist church on a Sunday night, there's a very good chance you've heard of Lottie Moon. All of the children in our family were called by shorter, clipped versions of longer names. I was 40 years a missionary in China, but I wasn't born in China. Oh no, indeed not. I was born at Viewmont, a plantation in Virginia, where I was taught all the things that Southern girls needed to know, like how to hold my teacup just right when entertaining guests in the parlor. And of course, my mother made sure that I had fine tutors as when I was a young child. And then I later attended girls' schools, the Albemarle Female Institute, and the Virginia Female Seminary, and eventually Hollins University, where we learned even more refined parlor etiquette, you know, lest we be completely unrefined. Well, I always excelled in my academic work, especially in the study of languages. I worked in Greek and Latin and Hebrew and did some work in German. And one of my instructors wrote once, "Charlotte uses the English language perhaps better than any writer I have ever read." Well, I'm going to assume he had read Shakespeare. And so I'm going to assume that he did not really mean what he was saying. He was just bragging on one of his students who had done a good job. And I did always excel in my academic work. However, we also received grades in deportment. Now, I don't know if you boys and girls nowadays receive grades in how you behave yourselves around your fellow students and your teachers. Well, I never had an acceptable mark in deportment. There were always so many interesting things to do and to say. I remember one holiday, Mama cried the whole time that I was at home. "Lottie, Lottie, Lottie," I heard her say as I entered the south portico of the mansion. "Why do you insist on embarrassing this family?" "Mother dear, what do you mean?" was my reply. "Why did you climb to the top of the bell tower on April Fool morning and stuff the bell with blankets and sheets and pillows on April Fool?" "Oh, Mother, we hate that bell," was my reply. "And besides, it made a delightful April Fool trick." Well, Mother didn't think that was very funny. And of course, her interrogation over the next few days revealed that it had been my idea, and that I had done most of the climbing and all of the stuffing. And it was decided that I, Lottie Moon, would return to the campus and I would never stuff nor climb again as long as I lived. Now, around this time, I became embroiled in a kind of controversy on campus, you see. We were required to attend a chapel service in the mid-morning. Well, it was all right with me if other people wanted to gather to pray to this being whom they believed could enter into their lives, but at that point in my life, I saw no need for that. Plus, I didn't think they ought to say that we had to go. So I didn't attend for several days, and I influenced other girls to do the same. And another letter was written home to my mother. And after her visit to the campus on that occasion, it was decided that I, Lottie Moon, would never miss another chapel service as long as I lived. You know, I think now I realize I had embarked on what I view as the intellectual period of my life. You know, I had encountered the writings of the ancient philosophers, and I'd read their works in the original texts. And to be honest, I saw hardly any value at all in what my mother tried to teach me, especially about the Lord Jesus Christ. And so, but I do admit I had been known to attend worship services to watch how people behaved. You know, the psychology of salvation was interesting to me. And so I have been known to attend worship services to watch how people behaved. And I found myself at the First Baptist Church of Crewe, Virginia. A revival had been sweeping across the Carolinas and over into Virginia. And Dr. John Broadus was bringing a series of sermons. And a friend invited me to attend. And all I can say about that evening is, when I entered that tiny sanctuary, something was different. I think for the first time, I saw the people of God. I saw the church. I saw how they related to each other, and I could tell they loved and cared about each other. And I watched and heard them as they sang the glorious hymns of the faith. And then we sat together and heard a powerful sermon by Dr. Broadus. And while he spoke, everything my mother had ever tried to teach me began to make sense. And I think for the first time I realized something really important. I've never forgotten it. I realized we have a physical self, you know, and we're all different. Every person who ever lived is different. No one is exactly like anybody else. And we have an intellectual self, and that's what makes us able to learn and to know and understand and to reason. And we have an emotional self, and that's how we respond and react, and it's a big part of our personality. And we have a psychological self, and that's a little more complex, but it has a lot to do with how we are and who we are. But none of those parts of us work as God intended until the spiritual self brings them into harmony. Oh, it was the most wonderful revelation. All I know to say is I figured out who Jesus was. Lottie Moon got saved. It was on a Thursday evening. And do you know what I later learned? The girls in the dormitory had been praying for me. And one of them had invited me to attend the service. And they had even discussed the fact that they'd never seen anyone like their little Lot. That's what they called me. The energy, the focus, the determination, the stamina, the intelligence. And they knew that if God could ever get hold of my life, there was no limit to what could be accomplished. Oh, I'm so glad they prayed for me. And I think that the people of China were glad. One of those little girls wrote in her diary just a few weeks later, "Our little Lot doesn't look the same. She doesn't sound the same. She doesn't dress the same. Our little Lot has been saved." And she was so right. Of course, I set to my new life just as I'd always done, with all the energy and focus and determination I could muster. And I began to write materials for teaching children in the churches. And I went around in a large area speaking to women's groups. And during this time, I earned one of the first master's degrees ever awarded a woman in the South. And a friend of mine, Miss Ann Stafford, and I went to Cartersville, Georgia, where we started a girls' school. Now, what else would two fine daughters of the South do but do for other girls the same kind of thing that had been done for us? Of course, Ann taught math and the sciences, and I taught literature and languages and elocution, and we taught good moral Christian conduct for girls. And of course, we taught parlor etiquette, lest they be completely unrefined. It was a wonderful work. Some of the finest families in the South sent their daughters to study with us. I remember one evening, Ann and I sat by the fire in the parlor. We'd marked our papers for the day, and I was telling her of a letter I had received from Miss Anne Hasseltine Judson, serving in Burma. In fact, I had begun to correspond with the wives of missionaries around the world. I wanted to know what the people in all those countries wore and what foods they ate and how their language looked when it was written on the page. And I was telling her of the letter from Miss Judson, and then we began to discuss the Oriental world, and I remember saying, oh, you know, the Oriental world is so different from ours. Their consistently dark hair across all the races, and their views on the rearing of children, and their views on the care of the elderly. And then Anne said something. She said, well, there's always China. And she continued with other conversation, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. Because when she said the words, there's always China, I heard a bell ringing in my ears. I literally heard a bell. I'd never experienced anything like that before. And that evening, I retired with a very odd feeling, and I didn't know the meaning of the bell and its ringing. And I didn't sleep much, and then over the next few days, I wrestled with the possibility that God might be clearly calling me to go to China as a missionary. And sure enough, within a few weeks, I gave out word that I would be seeking appointment as one of the first women ever appointed by the Foreign Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention, and that I would be going to China. Well, you can imagine what people around me said. Lottie, don't go over there to that heathen land. You won't be safe. You don't know anything about those people. You don't know that language. And then others, as well-meaning as they were, said, no, you stay here. We need women like you, educated, refined, and good at teaching. We need you to stay here and work with our girls, and then let God call some of them to the foreign field. But as well-meaning as they were, they had not heard the bell ring. And if you've ever heard the bell ring, you know you cannot ignore it if you're going to be happy. And so, in 1873, I traveled across this country on a train bound for San Francisco. And there I boarded a ship bound for China, where I was to live for 40 years with only 3 furloughs. Now, I am probably the only person who ever hit the high seas who was seasick for 25 days. I could not walk about the deck. I could not study the Chinese language. I could not read the beloved scriptures for encouragement and solace. I reclined for 25 days. It was the most frustrating experience I had ever had. But I later decided that dealing with that seasickness was a small task compared to the culture shock I experienced when I saw the port of Shanghai. So many people, and so very different from myself, and all moving. And it was a teeming mass of humanity. And the sights were so odd, the sounds were so foreign, and the smells were sour. They were sickening. They were even nauseating. And for the first time, to be honest, I became afraid. I became afraid I might not be able to do what God had called me to do. And I was to ride from Shanghai to Dangzhou, which was like the headquarters for the work in that region of the country. And I was to ride in a shensi. Now, that's a platform, a wooden platform that rests on the shoulders of young Chinese men. And there's a chair on top, and then a woven basket-like structure over that. And the Chinese royalty and Western women were to ride in the shensi, lest the hot sun or cold wind harm our delicate complexion, or the rocky terrain harm our delicate ankles. Well, that thing also made me seasick. And when I arrived in Dangzhou, I was considerably more humbled than I had ever been. But with a few days to rest and recover, and to get my bearings, I loved the Chinese people. And I later learned I set a kind of record. I was almost fully functioning on the field within 2 weeks. And of course, not everyone realizes that my sister, Edmonia Moon, had preceded me to China under a different appointment. She had gone under the gospel mission movement. And Eddie and I did what the Foreign Mission Board had told me to do. We started a girls' school. Now, what else would 2 American girls do but do for Chinese girls the same kind of thing that had been done for us? Of course, we didn't teach them about drinking tea in our way because, of course, we know it all started there. We've all heard about all the tea in China. But we taught them their own literature and their own language, and we taught them about good moral conduct, and we taught them good health and hygiene habits, and we taught them the glorious stories from the Bible. I remember telling the girls one day about Daniel in the lion's den. And I exaggerated about the lions, but no one seemed alarmed at all. And then someone whispered to me that I was using the word for lice, and that no one was really afraid of lice. Almost everybody had them. And to be honest, for the first few years of my work, every day was filled with just such discoveries about the Chinese language and customs and culture. I remember taking stock at the end of 3 years of hard work and realizing that we had 15 high-class Chinese girls come to, as the Chinese say, fill their stomachs with learning. Well, I knew that I loved the girls and I wanted to do what I was supposed to do, but I couldn't get past the feeling that if God had called me to win China, I wasn't making very much progress. And about this time, Edmonia became ill. I've thought a lot about what happened to Eddie. And I think I've figured out that Eddie felt deep down that there might be something wrong with being born Chinese. And this attitude toward the people caused her to want to Americanize them and Westernize them before she could share the love of Jesus with them or teach them as children. And we sent her to Tokyo, hoping that she could get herself back. But alas, word came, in fact, in the night. And the courier brought a message that persons who were with her feared she might take her own life. She was so desperate. And that I would have to come home right away and bring her home to Virginia. And when I arrived in Tokyo, I saw her more distraught than any person I had ever seen. And I knew that I would have to bring her home to Viewmont. And I think Eddie knew she could never serve abroad in a foreign culture again. And I might have thought the same thing about myself, especially because I'd had my doubts about the school. But I've learned this. If you have a problem, sometimes if you can get some distance from it, you might be able to identify the cause. And you might be able to identify the solution. Well, I can tell you, when I was in Virginia, as I viewed China from across the American continent and the Pacific Ocean, I decided that whoever told me to start a girls' school in China had never been to China and didn't know very much about the Chinese culture. I decided that I was going to wear what the Chinese wore. I was going to sleep as the Chinese slept. And I was going to eat what the Chinese ate. Oh, it was the most wonderful revelation. I aligned myself with the work of a Mrs. Holmes, who was like the mother of the work in North China. We would travel to as many as 15 villages in a 2-week period. Now, I confess to you, I was called the devil woman. And I was called the fat lady. At my high starch diet, I began to gain weight. But I was also called the Reverend Miss Moon and the Heavenly Book Visitor. And I was called the Cookie Lady because I made cookies for the children using my mother's old tea cake recipe. They loved those cookies. You know, I remember one day in a single village, I went to 9 homes in one day, and I ate 9 eggs and drank the water in which they had been boiled. And then I returned home that evening to a hostess who apologized because she had only 3 eggs for the evening meal. And I ate those eggs and drank that water and retired for the evening. Now, I have to tell you, I didn't really want to eat a dozen eggs in one day, but I knew that the egg was reserved for the honored guest. And what that meant was I had been honored, respected, even revered in every home I'd been in that village. Now, Mrs. Holmes was many years older than I, and she was struggling with some health issues, and it was hard work. You know, for a Westerner to speak Chinese means all of the upper part of the body must be used to force the sounds through the nasal cavities to imitate those tones of the language. And so it was tiring, especially in the throat and upper body. And sometimes we were speechless at the end of a day, couldn't utter a sound. And so this person in another country wrote her a letter saying that she had found that if she would rest in the early afternoon of each day, it would renew her strength and it would probably extend her ministry. And so she and I discussed this and decided that we would do this. And so we were resting in the Kang one afternoon, and I heard an odd sound. And I opened my eyes to see people watching us sleep. And there were some were close to us and others. The flaps had been lifted on the sides, and there were people outside watching, about 50 people watching us sleep. And this young man came forward and pulled on my sleeve. Moon Li Ti, he said, that's what they called me. Moon Li Ti, we walk 50 miles, I hear you teach. Now you will teach or you will sleep. Oh, I was so embarrassed to be caught napping in the middle of the day. And I can tell you, it was a long time before I ever closed my eyes while the sun was still shining. There was too much work to be done. And there did come a call from a very dark region of China called Pingdu. Well, people said, no American has ever survived very long in Pingdu. But we don't go there with our message. But I kept thinking, these people called for the gospel message to be brought there. And so I was persistent, I confess, very persistent, and I received permission to travel there, only if I agreed to take some young Chinese men and women with me, and to travel only at night by lantern light. I found a wonderful openness to our message. I found people who wanted to know about the love of Jesus Christ, and I'll tell you, many of the customs, like the foot binding of the little girls, and many other harsh customs were not nearly so ingrained in that rural area as they were in the cities. And so, I'd gone to scout out the region. I stayed 2 years, and I began something I became fairly famous for, letter writing. Now, I always insisted that anyone who worked with me write for at least an hour a day in English. It was therapeutic, you know. We would go for weeks, sometimes months, without hearing a word of English spoken. And we could write in our diaries or journals, things that were happening to us and how we felt about them. And we could take passages of Scripture and write about them, or we could write our prayers. And we could also write articles to be published. Many of the state newspapers, Baptist organizations, had begun to publish state newspapers. And we could write articles about our work. And of course, we could write letters home to family and friends and to churches. Here's a letter I wrote during that time. I must in this land plod on in patience, waiting in faith during the time of seed sowing. The harvest will come with time, I know. And in China, what a harvest it will be. And then this letter, actually, the whole Southern Baptist Convention adopted this as a kind of a theme one year when they were recruiting foreign missionaries. I wrote, "Send on the missionaries. The Lord is calling. Send on the missionaries. I know they're there because I have been praying for them." And then this letter. I confess to you, I was very frustrated when I wrote it, but I also confess that I meant every word of it. It is strange to me that over 1 million Southern Baptists can provide only 3 missionaries for all of China. I don't know how this looks in heaven. It looks very strange in China. Well, my pleas were heard. A young woman in Maryland, Annie Armstrong was her name. She had herself felt a call to foreign missions as a very young woman, and then later she realized that America is also a mission field, and so she had organized the women in the churches across the South to serve various ethnic groups. And they tried to meet the needs of African Americans in the Deep South, Native American tribes in the West and Midwest, and large immigrant groups in the port cities of the Northeast. As immigrants came across the Atlantic and flooded into those huge ports, often 15 languages might be spoken in a very small area. And of course, sometimes 3 or 4 families would have to live in one house. And of course, eventually, most of those persons were settled out across the states. Perhaps some of your ancestors came into this region during that very time. But the needs were great, and the women met the needs of many of these people. And she began to wonder if perhaps she should organize the women to support foreign missions with a single annual offering. And she wrote several missionaries around the world, including me. And I wrote back immediately and said, yes, take such an offering. But I suggest you take it near Christmas time, because that is when Americans are more willing to share with other people. Because that is when they realize the gift God gave when He gave His Son. And so the first foreign mission offering was taken in 1888. Well, by that time, I had received a sizable inheritance from my mother's estate. And I sent $1,000 to the first offering. And that was put together with what everybody else gave. There was enough money to send several missionaries around the world. 2 young women were to come to North China to help me. I was so glad. I had agreed to come home on furlough. I'd been 14 years without a furlough. But I stayed on 2 more years just to be sure they knew what to do while I was away. And then I turned my face homeward. I stayed well over a year. I was able to attend the Southern Baptist Convention that year and to speak on behalf of the way Southern Baptists appoint missionaries from a central agency, with all of the churches giving their resources to a central agency so that they can support and sustain missionaries and their families abroad. And of course, I was able to insist, and I do mean insist, that Southern Baptists remove the word heathen from all of its publications and its documents and its literature. I assured them that the Chinese people were honorable, noble, intelligent, and resourceful, and they were anything but heathen. And of course, I was able to visit with my family. Another of my sisters, Oriana, who was one of the first women medical doctors ever to practice across the South. And she had given birth to 12 sons. And I knew that those little nephews were growing up, and I wanted to be a part of their lives. You know, I think I knew by then I would not have a family of my own. And I had an interesting conversation with one of those fellows. I was in the parlor alone, and the little boy came in and said, "Aunt Lottie, I want to ask you something that nobody else will ask you. Why didn't you get married?" And he was referring to the fact that I had sent a letter home saying that the family should prepare for a wedding. And then, almost immediately, came another letter saying there would be no wedding. But I didn't give any explanation, and everybody was wondering, but nobody else would ask. And this is the only time I ever talked about that. I said, well, you see, I knew what God wanted me to do with my life. He made it very, very clear. I couldn't misunderstand it. And I really had no other choice, you see, because God opened an opportunity for Professor C.H. Toy to teach theology at Harvard University. And so I had no other option. And I did return to China, and for 9 years, I had probably the most productive period of all my work. Schools were springing up everywhere. What had been impossible 20 years before was now entirely possible. The Chinese people wanted their children taught by American teachers. And I developed teaching materials and trained native teachers. And then I came home one last time. Now, I remember weeping at the train station when it was time to return. There were family members there. I was 64 years old. And many of my family members did not think I should return to China. There were those who said I looked more as if I were in my 80s or 90s because life in a very difficult place had taken its toll on my physical appearance. But I wasn't comfortable in America anymore, you know. The food didn't taste right. The clothes didn't feel right. And I didn't know what to say. You know, the women talking always, you know, about fashions and table linens and their grandchildren, and I didn't know what to say. And besides, I longed for the Chinese people, especially the beautiful, intelligent children. And I knew it would be a difficult journey, and it was a very hard journey back. I faced some very difficult times when I arrived. And I hesitate to share some of those experiences with you because I do not want you to think that I had a sad life. I did not. I had a wonderful life. God gave me an exciting work to do, and He enabled me to do it. But the Boxer Rebellion had begun. And of course, we know what civil war can do to a nation and its people. And of course, we had to clear our own homes out for 3 months once in an effort to kill the rats to control the bubonic plague as it swept through. And then 3 successive years of drought caused crop failure. And by that 3rd year, malnutrition and starvation were rampant in the country. Many people were starving to death. And during this time, a beautiful young woman came to serve with us. And of course, the smallpox had swept through the land every few weeks. And we had to bury multiple bodies in one grave for a period of time. We had no time to mourn the dead. We had so much to do caring for those who were struggling to live. And this young woman was so beautiful. Her face looked like a porcelain doll. And I remember thinking, I wonder what life in this place will do to you. And sure enough, she became ill. And she was so sick. And then, after a few days, her symptoms changed. And I don't think I ever saw anybody with a fever that high. And then, a third time, her symptoms changed. And she was so sick. And I held her in my arms and rocked her like a baby. And she sobbed, I want to go home. I want my mama. I want to go home. I'd rather go home than go to heaven. I am so sick. Well, she did survive, but she was weakened, or her health was really ruined, I think. And when she was strong enough, she was still pale and frail, but of course we returned her to the United States. She felt like a failure. Her goal in life had been to serve in China. She'd heard me speak in a church on one of my trips home. Later, a young doctor came new to the field, and I described her symptoms to him. He said, you know, she must have had 3 different strains of smallpox in immediate succession. And then he looked right into my eyes and said, you know, we have a vaccination for that. I started writing more letters in which I said, don't send us anybody else who hasn't had a smallpox vaccination. It was the least we could do, you know. And that was the beginning of Southern Baptists requiring anyone who was going to serve abroad to have extensive physical examinations and to be vaccinated appropriately. It's the least we could do, you know, to equip them to face the physical battles they were going to face. And as conditions worsened, we were discouraged from traveling. It really was not safe to be out on the roads at all, but I heard about a woman who had cast herself off a very high place down onto some rocks. And she had lain for several days in the hot sun, wailing. Her suicide attempt had failed. She had lost her husband and all of her children to war or famine or disease. And I knew, because of the Chinese view of suicide, that no one would touch her body. And so I took some young men with me, and we traveled across the miles. We went down to that deep, rocky place, and I rolled her body onto a stretcher. And we brought her back across the distance and to my home. And I put her on my own bed. And I washed her body clean, and I bound up her wounds, and I smoothed her gnarled hair. And I sat in a chair beside the bed and sang "Jesus Loves Me" in Chinese. The young doctor, who was very disillusioned at that point because we were all powerless to save the Chinese race. And these words were written in his diary that very evening. He wrote, I look tonight through the doorway at the great Lottie moon, the most remarkable woman I have ever known. And she's caring for a wretched creature who doesn't even know she's in the world. It's like looking at wasted alabaster in darkness. Do you know what that young disillusioned doctor did not know? My life was not wasted. If I did what God made clear to me that I was supposed to do, my life was not wasted. And then, eventually, my own health became an issue. I was losing weight, and I was suffering some other physical issues, and the doctor left his son with me. He was very concerned, and so he left his son with me for several weeks, actually. And the young boy wrote his father a letter one day and had it hand-delivered by courier. He said, "Papa, Miss Moon must be losing her eyesight because she doesn't see the bugs in the cereal. But I guess it doesn't matter because she doesn't eat the cereal anyway." I had no appetite, you know. And there were always people there to eat it. There were orphans and widows in and out of my home every day. In fact, one young boy who lost both parents within a few days, his name was Li Pio. Do you know that he grew up to be a Chinese Baptist pastor? And records show he baptized over 2,000 people in 1 year. Isn't that remarkable? Do you know what that teaches me? It's not so much what we do, but it's the life we live, and we touch other people's lives, and that washes up on shores far from anywhere we could ever go. Eventually, I took to my bed much of the time. I admit I was very sad. I was powerless to stop the death and suffering around me. And I don't really know how long I was in a deep sleep or unconscious, or I was just very weakened, I suppose. But at any rate, I wasn't seen around my home for several days. And then I waked to the sound of people crying. And there were people, fellow missionaries and Chinese friends there. And the doctor was here. He diagnosed me with self-inflicted malnutrition and starvation. He said she's given away all her food to the Chinese people, and that I would have to come home, although he doubted I would survive the trip. And a nurse, Miss Cynthia Miller, was on this side, and she was due for furlough anyway, and she would accompany me home to Virginia. And they were all weeping. You know, they thought about me as their mother or grandmother, and they were saddened. And the doctor lifted me and placed me on a stretcher. And I sat straight up. And he said, "Lay down, Miss Moon, lay down, lay down. We're going to take you home." And I said, "I most certainly will not lay down, but I will lie down." And I did. I reclined and allowed them to cover me with warm blankets and take me from my home. The man who lifted me onto the ship as it rode anchor in Kobe, Japan, said that I weighed less than 50 pounds. Miss Miller, who was the nurse in the tiny stateroom with me that evening, said that I talked about my childhood, and I talked about my work, and I talked about the Chinese children, and I sang "Jesus Loves Me" in Chinese. And I asked her if she knew how the Spirit felt in a room. And she said yes. And I said, "Pray that the Spirit will come into this room. I'm cold, and I long for the warmth of His Spirit." And that was December 24th, 1912. I was 72 years old. Now, I don't think I have to tell you that my name is not really Lottie Moon. My name is Gail Hartzog. Let me say that again. My name is not Lottie Moon. My name is Gail Hartzog. I have researched her life. Lottie Moon died in Kobe, Japan. Her remains, she was 72 years old, and it was Christmas Eve in 1912. And her remains were cremated according to international law and brought back to Virginia for burial. Now, I always think I should say more than once that I'm not Lottie Moon, because I've been told that there's a man in Port St. Joe who thinks that Lottie Moon came to his church. He still insists that Lottie Moon came to his church. So I thought maybe I should say more than once. You know, people can tune you out along the way. But I have researched her life, and I can honestly say, although there are many resources and many stories written about her, and not all of them agree on some of the smaller details, but I can honestly say that everything that's in the monologue is written somewhere about her. My favorite work is probably It Cannot End at Kobe. And you know, if Lottie Moon could write us a letter today, I don't know what she would say, but I think I know some things she could say. And these are given as what the writers of It Cannot End at Kobe consider 5 truths about her life. Her life illustrates and that she truly believed. The first is, you can't claim to be God's without letting God claim you. You see, it's not about us. We are in God's work, and we all have a role to play. But it's to help Him accomplish His will and His work. And number 2, we are to cultivate all talents, and God will find places for their use. Now, I'm not talking about spiritual gifts. I'd probably have to talk to your pastor or some other theologians a long time about whether you can even cultivate a spiritual gift. But you can cultivate a talent. And that's something you can do. Your experience, your education, all kinds of experiences have taught you how to do things. And we are to cultivate those. And God finds places for them to be used. I thought it was interesting that Lottie Moon was always curious about other cultures and other languages. And that meant that she fit right in when it was time for her to actually function on the foreign field. And the third is, God carves out places for people to serve. And then He expects service and devotion. You know, I don't think Lottie Moon thought it was a big deal to be a missionary to China. She knew that's what God wanted her to do. But it seems she thought everybody should find out what God wants him or her to do and then do it. That's the way the kingdom works. Now, another important element about her is that she only grew to be 4 feet 2. Some sources say 4 feet 3 inches tall. You can see why I don't say that during the monologue, since I'm considerably taller than that myself. But what better height could she be if she's going to spend her life among Chinese women? She was perfectly suited for the work God had for her to do. The fourth is, if we think service to God is easy, then we've misunderstood our instructions and the example of Jesus Christ. What is it in our instructions in the Bible or in the example of Jesus that makes us think we're supposed to have everything we want? You know, I can see a lot of preaching on TV that encourages me to order up what I want. You know, but I'm telling you, God did not give us the privilege of prayer for us to order up what we want and expect it to be delivered. That's not the purpose of prayer. God gave us that so we could communicate with Him. We must realize that Jesus' example shows us just how difficult it can be to do God's work. And the fifth is, needs are everywhere. And if we're not in the middle of them, we are short on God's love. Now, I don't really travel around. Of course, I've been doing this for about 45 years, I think. I think I've forgotten now, but you can tell how old I am now. I've forgotten. But in all that time, I don't really do the monologue to get people to give to the offering. I hope you will. I assume you have a goal in your church, and I hope you achieve that goal. And there are, of course, many needs around the world, and we need millions, literally millions of dollars to continue what we now have going as Southern Baptists all around the world. And I do hope that you will give to the offering. And really, Lottie Moon never knew that the Christmas offering was named for her. Annie Armstrong came out of retirement as soon as people began to realize that Lottie Moon had truly starved to death on the foreign field. She came out of retirement to say that it had been her idea to have it near Christmas, and that she thought it would be appropriate with such a high price that she paid for the Chinese people, that the offering be named for her. But I want to challenge you to think now about somebody who needs something done that only you can do because of who you are. In this season of the year, think now about somebody or some group or some family who needs encouragement and love, needs to know the message of the Lord Jesus Christ. And you share with that person during this time of the year. I do thank you for inviting me to come tonight. I have to say, my sister is Gardis Watts. I'm very proud of her. And I hear about you all the time. She tells me how you've taken her right in and been. And we appreciate that. We grew up in a small rural church in Chipley, Florida, Holmes Creek Baptist Church. And that's where I started doing the monologue about 45 years ago. And then my husband and I moved to Marianna. He was transferred with his work to Marianna. And I retired as a dean at Chipola College, and he retired from the University of Florida College of Ag. And then we retired and moved to Lake City, Florida, close to our children and our one granddaughter. And so I do appreciate your inviting us to come tonight. Let's have prayer. Lord, we love you. We thank you and we praise you. We come before you thanking you for this beautiful life of selflessness and sacrifice and total and absolute commitment. Help us to learn from it, Lord. Help us to see what we are supposed to do and how we are supposed to be in your kingdom. I thank you for this church. I pray for their pastor as he leads them and all their staff, Lord, as they work here. And I pray for each member, Lord. Help them all to find their place in your work and help them to reach out in this community and to be what you want this church to be. These things I pray in your name. Amen.
Thank you so much.
Yes.